Hello, good evening, guys. You are finally live. My name is Solly, and this evening we're going to talk about food photography, and I'll also share some tips on how you can create the perfect flat lay. I'm really happy to see that there are so many of you that are connected this evening. And first of all, I would like to thank our hosts, Wex, BenQ, and X-Rite. And while waiting for more people to connect to the platform, I will quickly introduce myself. I'll just remove the webcam so you can see my screen. Perfect. So my name is SOLLI KANANI. For those who don't know me, I'm from Sweden, but I'm based in Paris in France since almost 10 years. This is also the city where my interest for photography grew and where I started to work professionally as a photographer. I do many types of photography as I love traveling, and I spend a part of my time throughout the year doing landscape photography in different parts of the world. But food photography is my main occupation. Ever since I was a child, I have loved food and cooking. It was a natural step for me to document the process of making food when I started with photography. Today, I work both with brands, restaurants, and hotels, capturing plates of Michelin-starred and award-winning chefs. I was also shortlisted in the prestigious Pink Lady Food Photographer of the Year 2020 with these photos, and a finalist in the Chefs World Summit Food Photography competition this year. I am also a Nikon partner and an ambassador for DxO Labs, the X-Rite Photo Colorado, and you can follow me on Instagram. I have two accounts, one for only food, which is Solly Food, and Solly K for my travel photos. And recently, I also created a YouTube channel devoted for food photography. And you can find the link in the Linktree link, and you also have the link to my website. So now when you know a little bit more about me, let's start. This evening, I hope to share as much as possible of the basics in food photography. And I will also show you how to create the perfect flat lay. To give you an overview of what I will cover this evening, this is the agenda. First, I will go through the necessary equipment for food photography, everything from camera to lenses. Light is a big part of any kind of photography, and I will go through its importance and talk about natural and artificial light and how you can work with it when shooting food. When you start with food photography, you'll quickly realize you need to invest in food props and backgrounds, and this evening I will share where I look for them. Color is very important in food photography, and I will share how and what tools I use in order to get the true to life and accurate colors in my images. And last but not least, I'll go through how I go from idea to a final image with a flat lay photo and share some tips and my workflow before the post-processing. We will have around 45 minutes, and as you can see, there are many things we will cover, but due to the time limitation, we will not be able to go in very deep in the topics. But what I want to do today is to explain some basic things in food photography for you in the most intuitive way and giving you the tools so that you immediately can try and experiment at home. And if you have any questions during the webinar, don't hesitate to write them in the chat box, and I'll try to answer as many as possible in our Q&A session in the end of the webinar. And for information, the webinar is recorded and you will all receive a link to the replay tomorrow. So let's begin with the necessary equipment. First off, the camera. Having a DSLR or a mirrorless really doesn't matter, but I would suggest it's full frame. When you begin, a basic camera would be good enough, but make sure that you can use different lenses with it. Personally, I'm using a DSLR Nikon D850 and a mirrorless Nikon Z6. I shoot most of my images with a mirrorless. It has 24 megapixel. But if I'm shooting for a job commission where I know the images will be used for big prints, I would do the shooting with my D850 that has 45.7 megapixel. To me, the most important is that the camera is full frame so that I can use the best lenses, but also that it's lightweight. The important thing is to ask yourself what the purpose is of your food photography. If it's more for a hobby, a basic DSLR or a mirrorless will be good enough. If you're aiming for a professional job in food photography and where you know that files for big prints are demanded, then make sure the camera has many megapixels, at least above 30. The benefits of DSLR over mirrorless is that they have a wider selection of lenses and they also work better in low light situations. However, in food photography, you usually use light and you rarely increase the ISO. Mirrorless cameras are lighter, has less lenses, but I think that this will change in the close future. So just to explain the difference between a full frame and a camera with a cropped sensor. A full frame camera has a larger sensor and is equivalent to 35mm film. And a cropped sensor simply has a smaller sensor, meaning you will see less of your scene in your frame compared to a full frame. If you are on a budget, a cropped sensor camera is fine. I started with a cropped sensor and didn't upgrade to a full frame until 6 years ago. However, if you buy lenses for a cropped sensor, you would need to buy new lenses for your full frame when you make the upgrade. In the end, it's not the camera that is making your photos, it's your skills and talent. A skilled photographer can make amazing photos with any camera, even with a mobile. Then we have the lenses. If you want to shoot a variety of food photos and like to have different depth of field and getting different lengths to the subjects, you'll have to invest in different lenses. The more different lenses you have, the more creative you can be by getting different types of photos. And depending on the camera you have, a full frame or a cropped sensor, the lens type will be different. The lenses I'm recommending here are all for a full frame camera. There are 4 lenses that I use for food photography, and it's the 50mm, 105mm macro, 85mm, and 35mm lens. I will go through each one of them and explain their benefits. The 50mm lens is the one that I use in the majority of my food photos. It's also called the Nifty 50 as it's so versatile. It's perfect for flat lays, as you can see in this image, but also for 45-degree angle, like this image, and also for head-on shots like this photo. So if you're about to buy your first lens and do food photography, I would recommend to start with a 50mm. This is one of my all-time favorite lenses for food photography, the 105mm macro lens. It's an expensive lens, but if you like macro shots and close-ups where the details of the food is beautifully visible, the 105mm macro will not disappoint you. With this lens, you will be able to do macro shots like this one, where you can see the texture of the blueberry. and the water drops that are very sharp, and also close-ups like this one, where you can see all the details of the pastry. When using the 105mm, I'm often using it with a smaller aperture, a high f-stop like f16, in order to get all the details. And at that aperture, you will definitely need to have lots of light in your scene, either working near a window with lots of light or having artificial light is obligatory. But if you love details, this lens is for you. This is not the lens I hear other food photographers are using very often. It's normally used in portrait photography. However, I love using it for food too. It's perfect when you want to get a bit closer than your 50mm, and it has a wonderful and creamy bouquet. This is not a lens I use very often, but when I have many subjects in a bigger scene, it's very useful. It's good to have this lens, but it totally depends on the photos you will do. It works great for big flat lays, but also ambience photos in the restaurants or in food markets. Be aware that it's not a close-up lens, so you'll not be able to get any close-up shots with details, but I think still that this lens is great to have as a complement. But of course, it's not mandatory and I don't use it very often. As you can see so far, I have mentioned prime lenses, and those are actually what I prefer working with. The 24-70mm lens is an all-around lens that I know many food photographers are using and recommend. I have tried it. This is one of the photos I took with it. However, I prefer working with prime lenses and believe that as a photographer, you will need to adjust your distance to the subject and not the other way around. But if you have the possibility, I would suggest you to try this lens and then decide if you want to invest in it or not. A tripod is mandatory if you want to have sharp images and also save time. The benefits of a tripod are many, but the most important ones that are for great use in food photography is that thanks to a tripod, you'll avoid out of focus images due to camera shake when shooting handheld, as the camera will be stabilized by the tripod. You'll also notice that when shooting food, there are always some of the subjects you will want to move around, meaning you would need to have your hands free to do so. Shooting handheld would mean that you have to find the perfect framing again each time you're changing something in the scene. But thanks to a tripod, you'll keep the camera in place and you'll save a lot of time. When shooting flat lays or overhead photos, you'll have to shoot straight above the subject. This can be done with a tripod, if it has a moving arm that you can position 100 degrees, or you can use a ladder, which I did in the beginning, but it's really a pain for the back. Using a C-stand means that you will attach the camera here to the boom arm, and then it's more convenient to shoot in tethering mode, using a cable or Wi-Fi from your camera connected to your computer. And then you can see how the frame looks like before you take the photo. But again, this is not essential if you're a beginner. Not until you feel that it's getting complicated walking up and down the ladder, I believe you should consider investing in a C-stand. As I mentioned in the beginning of this webinar, the light is very important in a photo. You can either choose to work with natural lights or artificial lights in food photography. When I was doing food photography as a hobby and still had an office job, my time to shoot food was extremely limited. I could never shoot during the weekdays as I left early to the office and came home already around sunset or when the light was very low. This meant I had only the weekends to shoot. I continued like this for a few years. Shooting with artificial light was terrifying for me. I had the impression it was very complicated and the technical terms kept me away from artificial light for a long time until I decided to face my fears and I learned how to use it. Now when I work full-time as a photographer, I could use the daylight, but working professionally, I can't depend on the sun. And secondly, I also need to have control over the light. The strength of the light of the sun is changing all the time, meaning you will have to change the settings of your camera when shooting. With artificial lights, you will have the control of the strength of the light, and once it's set, you will not need to change the settings of your camera, and you can do the shooting any time of the day. And flash is also great when you want to take an action shot like these ones. Photos like these you need to take with an increased shutter speed and demands more light in the scene, and that's why shooting them with artificial light is best. Alternatively, you could use strong natural light, and if it's not enough, you can compensate by increasing the ISO, but not too much as it can give too much noise to the image. Artificial light is a whole universe for itself. We will not have time to dive in and talk about it in detail, but if you're interested in shooting with artificial light, I think it's important to know that there are speed lights and strobes. Personally, I'm using both. Speed lights are flash that you can use off camera. You simply attach a trigger in the hot shoe of your camera so that you can control and communicate with the speed light. Strobe is more powerful than speed lights, but also bigger and heavier. If you are a beginner, I would recommend you to start with speed lights. They are small and lightweight and very easy to carry around. Most of them require AA batteries, so you should be prepared to use rechargeable ones so you can recharge them between the shots. But there are speed lights that uses lithium batteries too. That is more practical. You simply have to make some research and see which one that suits your needs best. Speed lights can get warm after a while of shooting, while with the strobes you can use them on full power for a longer time. Strobes are very useful for product shootings or when you need a flash for half or a full day of shooting. When I'm shooting out for a client, for example in a restaurant, I'm always bringing my speed lights, and in my studio I use the strobe and speed lights depending on how long I will use them for the shooting and how strong light I need. When you have decided for what kind of flash you want to invest in, you will also need to buy modifiers and diffusers. If you would use a flash without any modifier or diffuser, the light would be pretty harsh and the shadows quite strong, which is also nice. Here in this photo, I used only speed light to resemble a sunny day. So you can see here that the light is very, very strong and the shadows are very strong as well. But if you want to have softer shadows and light, you would need to use soft boxes like this one, and also diffusers. They come in different shapes and dimensions, and it can get pretty expensive buying flash and all the other equipments in the beginning. You really don't need to buy everything. For example, instead of buying a diffuser, you could use a white sheet. And there are also many ways to make these yourself. If you Google, you'll find many do-it-yourself guides. You will quickly notice that food props and backgrounds plays a huge part in food photos. The plates, the kitchen tools, and cutlery are all important to display food, and the background will add a color and texture to the image. Personally, I love vintage kitchen items. They are unique and have so much history to tell with their signs of usage, so I usually go to flea markets, second-hand shops, and also Etsy to find the items I need. I also try to find ceramic artists who creates pottery that I find is matching the style that I want to have in my images. In this photo, you can see that the plates, cup, and the fork are items I bought in a second-hand shop in Sweden, and the small vintage milk bottle is something I found years ago in a flea market in Copenhagen. And in this image, I used a vintage wooden crate and an old bowl that I bought at the flea market in Paris. If you, like me, are into old and vintage items, I truly recommend you to visit your local flea market and second-hand shops regularly, but also when you are on travel, you will always find something to add to your collection. When it comes to backgrounds, there are different materials you can choose between. I have a selection of both vinyl and wooden boards, but also boards I have made myself. Vinyls are very practical and easy to transport. They are great when you're shooting on a location, but also in your studio or at home, as they don't take up any space. Today, there are very good vinyl backgrounds that look very authentic and are very easy to clean. In this image, I have used a vinyl with a wooden table print. It looks very authentic and matches the style of photo I wanted to take without the need of having a real big wooden table in the studio. There are also companies selling plywood boards that are primed with different materials to imitate the texture of stone, concrete, and even marble. I have a few of these. The advantages of these are that they look 100% real and the texture adds a flattering effect in the photos. For example, in this image, I have used a wooden board with a white concrete effect, and you can see the texture here in the top and also here on the sides. It adds a beautiful dimension to the photo. You can also make these backdrops yourself. All you need is plywood board and some paint and a sponge. In these images, you can see how I turned a plywood board into two different backdrops with white color and blue. The blue backdrop is actually the one that I used for this photo. And thanks to post-processing softwares, you can actually change the color of the background and adapt it to your scene. Like in this image, I wanted something gray and I used the blue backdrop that you saw in this image, and I simply made it gray in the post-processing. So you actually don't need to have backgrounds in different colors. You can actually change the color in the post-processing as well. Getting the colors right in a photo is important, but even more crucial in food photography. Food is something that we all can relate to, and as we want to create an interest and hopefully also evoke an appetite, it's good to get the colors right. The first thing you should ask yourself is if your white balance is correct. Because even if your subject you're photographing is white, it doesn't mean it will remain white in your image. It can have a warm or a cold tint. For those of you who are not familiar with white balance, I'll explain in short what it is, how it's measured, and how you can set the correct white balance. So a light source can either be described as warm, neutral, or cool. And these graduations are defined as color temperature and is measured in Kelvin. And this is a color temperature chart. And here you can see that the warmer or more yellow the light is, it has a lower degree of Kelvin, and the cooler or more blue the light is, it has a higher degree of Kelvin. So this means that the color temperature of the light affects what our camera is capturing. Even though our eyes will see an object as white, our camera is not as intelligent and can't adjust automatically to different color temperatures like our eyes can do. So here you can see an example of a photo of a bottle of milk. You know that milk is white, but depending on the light source, it can either get a warm or a cold tint. Correcting the white balance can be done in different ways. You can either set the white balance manually directly in your camera by taking a close-up photo of the 18% gray card. You can also use a color temperature meter or a color chart. Personally, I prefer using a color chart as it has more reference points and provide more precise colors. I'm using X-Rite's color chart called Color Checker Passport Photo, which I find very easy to use, and it saves me lots of time in the post-processing as I don't need to adjust the color temperature and white balance manually. It's a powerful tool and it's indispensable when you shoot in controlled lighting, in particular food photography, where it's crucial to get the colors right. Just to show you how easy it is to use it and the results you can achieve with it, I'll quickly guide you through the process. First of all, first to think of is that you have to shoot in RAW, and you have to place the color checker near the subject. Whenever the lighting changes or you change direction, you will have to take a new photo of the color checker. The size of the color checker should take at least 10% of the frame in an image that is 10 megapixel. You should avoid filling your entire frame with it, as vignetting might occur, and that would affect the color rendering. The passport should be positioned in parallel to the plane of the lens. Make sure it's not tilted. To create the color profile as accurate as possible, it's important that the passport is perfectly in focus. The passport should be perfectly exposed, not under or overexposed, as it might inflict with the color rendering. When you're done with the shooting, you simply create a customized camera profile in your post-processing software. Here you can see an example. The before photo to the left and to the right when it's using the customized camera profile created with X-Rite's color checker. So here you can see that the white balance is correct and the before photo is pretty warm and the colors are not how they were when I was shooting the scene. But this you can easily fix thanks to the color checker passport, and you can easily create the customized camera profile in your software. So if you want to see all the steps, I have one video dedicated to this color checker passport in my YouTube channel. A monitor suitable for photographers is essential, especially if you print your photos or simply publish them online. I used the screen of my iMac and MacBook Pro for quite long when I was post-processing my photos, until I discovered that there were monitors for photographers. Today I'm using BenQ's SW321C monitor with a 32-inch panel. It's a very powerful monitor which I recommend, and BenQ has a whole series of monitors for photographers in different sizes. What most of them have in common, and that is an important feature in a monitor for a photographer, is the screen size. They are from 24-inch and bigger. They all have 4K resolution, which provides excellent work experience, but also exceptional accuracy of details and textures. They also cover 100% of the sRGB color space that is used when publishing images online, and 99% of the color space Adobe RGB that is used when preparing images for print. Thanks to these color spaces, you have the pleasure to finally see so much more of the realistic color representation from your photos. It's quite mandatory that a monitor that will be used for photography also should have an IPS panel. IPS means in-plane switching. So depending on what angle you're looking at the screen, the saturation and contrast will remain. This means that adjustments made to the photo will look the same from any angle. I had another monitor from BenQ before the SW321C, which I was very pleased with. The monitors in the photographer series are of high quality, and the features that I like with the latest one that I'm using is the 32-inch screen that lets me dive into every detail of the image. It has a new matte finish, making your photos look like they are prints, and it also has a paper color sync technology, letting you simulate your prints and paper texture. When you work on your images, you want to be sure that you are seeing the real colors that your camera sensor was able to capture. Unfortunately, our displays and graphic cards, including mobile devices, are made by different technologies and materials. So the colors displayed can be affected by that. As an example, if you have a look at the same image in your monitor and in your laptop or even in your mobile, you will most likely notice some differences. So for this reason, in order to have an image ready to be printed or even just shared on social medias or online, the first step is to be sure that the device we are using for the post-production and visualization is correctly calibrated. And this is where a colorimeter sensor becomes relevant. Thanks to the combined use of a software and a hardware, the colorimeter sensor, or also called a probe, you'll be able to create an ICC profile that will let your monitor to display colors correctly. I am using this one from X-Rite, i1 Display Pro, that you can see here. The workflow is very simple. I will not go into detail, but in short, the software and the hardware will determine the accuracy response of your monitor. The final output will be an ICC profile that, once installed in your computer, will let your monitor to display colors correctly, taking into account the specific response of your device. So put in simpler words, with a calibrated screen and an ICC profile, different monitors can communicate with each other by numerically describing the colors that are displayed in the screens or other digital devices such as printers, etc. And to keep your monitor happy and healthy, it's advised to calibrate it at least once a month. So now we have been through some of the basics and important parts in food photography. Let's have a closer look on flat lay composition, from idea to a final image. So first of all, what makes a perfect flat lay? A flat lay can actually look flat and boring if you don't think of a few things. So first of all, try to tell a story with your image. Here I have, for example, added a scissor that I used to cut the rosemary and a fork and spoon showing that somebody is going to eat the muffins. And I also displayed the knife that I used to add the topping on the muffins. And here in the corner, you can see the bowl with the mascarpone topping. So all these together are telling a story. And when you're shooting a flat lay, it's also important to add layers to create textures. And for example, on these muffins, I added the mascarpone topping and the rosemary and blueberries and blackberries just to add different layers so we have a depth in the image. And you can also add a sense of motion by directing, for example, the knife and the spoon and the scissor in different directions, so you have a sense of motion in the image, and avoid putting the subject straight. And another important thing is to, in flat lays, is that the subjects should be sharp. So try to use minimum an aperture of f8 when you're shooting. Sometimes I already have an idea in my head of what I want to create, and sometimes I know what ingredients I want to use, but I don't have a clear image of what I can do with it. Then I usually have a look in Pinterest, and sometimes I also look in Instagram to find inspiration. Even food magazines are great to use as a resource. I buy food magazines in different languages every month, and also follow food shows and other things related to food to get inspired and keep myself up to date with food trends. Let's say you know what you want to photograph. You have visualized your idea. However, the step from idea and to shoot the scene needs planning. There is always a thought behind how the food is set up in the scene, and this is very important. If you want your images to pop out among the many food photos we are fed with every day, there are a few composition rules in photography that are used in landscape, food, and many other types of photography. One composition rule that is used often in flat lay is the rule of thirds. This is when you divide a photo equally into thirds with 2 horizontal and 2 vertical lines. The crossing points that are here are the point of interest, and if you put your main subject in any of these, the result tends to be more balanced and eye-pleasing. Then we have the golden triangle. It's another powerful composition rule as it lets the eye of the viewer travel from one point to another. You can either place your subject along the diagonals or fill one of the triangles with a subject. The golden ratio is another composition rule. These compositions leads the eye of the viewer through the entire image. For example, here in the Fibonacci spiral that you get by drawing a curve from the opposite corners, you'll end up having a spiral, and you should place your main subject in the smallest square here, and then you can add other subjects along the rest of the spiral, and this will add flow and movement to the image. Another composition in the golden ratio rule is the 5-grid, and it resembles the rules of third, but as you can see, the center lines are closer to each other, meaning that your subject would be more centrally located and the viewer would see it faster. If you're using Photoshop, you can actually find these composition rules and apply them to your images. You simply click on crop and then you click here to get this drop-down menu with the different composition guides. Composition rules can be very useful if you have no idea where to start, and they work great as guiding lines. However, remember that these are only a support to help you. Don't hesitate to break the rules. The result will still matter on your artistic style and how you catch the attention of the viewer, and that can be with or without any of the composition rules. So before I shoot, I always sketch the scene that I have in my mind. Otherwise, I'll just lose time, and maybe at the moment I have the food ready, I'll have no clue of how to compose the food on the scene. So this step is very crucial. You don't need to be very talented, as you can see, and this is why I'm doing photography and I'm not a painter. You need to, I'm not very detailed in my sketches, but I write down the backdrop that I will use and the kitchen items and plates that I want to be in the scene. So for example, in this image, I noted down that I will use the blue backdrop and a white bowl for the mascarpone topping and a knife. Then I also sketched where I wanted to position the muffins. And no matter if it's a flat lay or a photo taken from another angle, I like to put subjects near the frame so that they are caught. When all the subjects are inside the frame, I feel it doesn't look very natural and it gives a sense of staging. But when the subjects are caught, I think it adds a sense of curiosity to the viewer. In this stage, I also decide where I will put the light source. In flat lays, I usually put the light here on top or on the side to create a flattering light in the image. And when you have your sketch done, you make a shopping list and a list for the props that you'll be using for the scene. Now when we have made the planning and prepared with all the ingredients, we are ready to proceed with the shooting. First, you bring out the background that you have chosen to use for the shooting. And then, depending on what kind of light you're using, you should prepare the lights. If you're using natural light, then I would advise you to go close to a window and make sure to shoot when there is a lot of light, and if necessary, also using a diffuser to transform the light to a softer light. If you'll be using artificial light, you simply set it up with a softbox and position it near the background. At this step, I would put some of the plates or utensils that I want to have in my scene just to set the flash. The goal is to be ready to shoot and have the perfect light when the food is ready. Once the scene is prepared with the background and light, I start cooking or preparing my dish. When these muffins were ready for the shooting, I used my sketch and could quickly place them on the background and create the scene I had envisioned. I will not go into depth of the editing of this photo, but I will show you quickly how I begin to process the image. I use Lightroom, Photoshop, and Nik Collection, and sometimes DX, so Photolab. And when I have the photo in RAW, I import it. And in Lightroom, I have created a color profile thanks to the X-Rite Color Checker Passport. So here you can see that first I select the profile that was created. So in this case, it's Blackberry Muffins profile. And then I also make sure to check to remove the chromatic aberration and enable profile corrections. And I also make sure to select the camera model and the camera brand and the lens brand. And after that, it's actually time to add your artistic style. So what I did in this image was that I increased the exposure a little bit, and I decreased the highlights, and I open up the shadows, as you can see here. And I also increased the whites and blacks, and I added a bit of texture and clarity as well. And then I played around a little bit with the colors, but I haven't done more than that. And here is the before and after image. Okay, guys, so I think we have reached the end of the webinar, and I really hope that you have learned something new. Before moving on to the Q&A session, I have a very good news, as Wex has a special offer for you. So they're offering 10% off X-Rite's products when you use the code X-Rite10 at the checkout, and also 5% off BenQ's monitors when you use the code BenQ5 at the checkout. This offer is valid until 8th of July 2020 on their website, and you'll also get these codes sent to you by email. So now we will be moving on to the question and answers session. I can already see that there are many questions that has been sent, which is great. Let's see, I will pick one of them. Hang on, there are many questions. Okay, so let's see. Okay, so first one, how do you keep your photos so sharp from front to back? If you want all the subjects to be sharp, then you have to use a lower aperture. So for example, it depends on the scene, of course, but for example, if I do the macro shots where everything is sharp, I use f16. But for other scenes, you should at least use f10 or above if you really want everything to be sharp. And let's see, we have another question. So isn't it expensive to buy so much food just to take photos? But that's a very good question. Actually, it can get very expensive, especially if you are working on your portfolio, because if you're working for a client, then the cost of the ingredients are all covered. But if you're working on your portfolio and you want to shoot food, what I would suggest is, for example, I made this photo with the blueberries and blackberry muffins for the webinar, but I also used these blueberries and I made a macro shot with them before. And after this scene, I made another scene and I used the same blueberries in porridge. So what you could do is to plan your shootings and try to use the ingredients in many different scenes as possible. And that way you don't need to buy the ingredients many times. How has COVID-19 impacted my work as a photographer, and if I have any advice for other photographers? This is a very good question as well from Vagesh in UK. To be honest, actually I think it was early March, 2 weeks before the lockdown in France, I had many jobs planned, especially for restaurants and hotels in Paris. And early in March, all my jobs were actually canceled because there were no tourists and the hotels were closing down. And then suddenly we had the lockdown for almost 3 months. So I didn't have any jobs to shoot in restaurants or hotels. But in the meanwhile, I did a lot of product shooting. So I think that's something that I can recommend, because there are still brands that needs to have their product shot. And so I occupied myself with product shooting during the lockdown. And then I also created a YouTube channel so I could share my skills in food photography with other photographers. And what I would advise for you now, I mean, if you have had your food photography jobs canceled, I think now is the moment to work on your portfolio and reach out to the clients again, because now when the restaurants and hotels are opening, they actually need new photos. So I think this is a very good moment to reach out to them. There are many questions that are dropping in. I'm trying to find a new one. Is it better to photograph warm or cold food? Very interesting question. Actually, I didn't mention it in the webinar, but I always shoot the food when it's cold. For example, yeah, I think in most cases, everything is cold. So even if I'm shooting a soup or a hot dish, I make sure it's cold when I'm shooting. But it depends. I mean, you could, if you want to have the effect of a heat in the photo, you could actually add the heat by artificial smoke behind the bowl. Or if you want to photograph a cup of hot chocolate, the hot chocolate doesn't need to be warm, but there are ways of adding artificial heat either in Photoshop, or you could just add artificial smoke behind the cup. Here we have a question from Mel Brown. How do you mount your camera for overhead shooting? For instance, what clamp and boom arm combination do you use? I actually use a C-stand from the brand Newer, and the boom arm was actually included. I think you can choose that when you're ordering on Amazon. So I think they sell it with and without the boom arm, and I bought it with a boom arm. And then you actually attach your, I'm using a ball head for my tripod, so I actually attach the same ball head on the boom arm, and then I just attach my camera to the boom arm. And then, do you have to be a good cook to be a good food photographer? Well, that's a very good question as well. Well, and I get it very often, you actually don't need to be a very good cook to be a food photographer. I mean, you can begin by just taking photos of fruits or vegetables, and if you want, you can also experiment with still life. And then you can also cook the food, but it's not, you don't need to be good. I mean, you can still prepare a beautiful plate without being good in, I mean, it doesn't need to be a real plate. So I think it's not necessary to be a good cook to be a good food photographer. So you don't need to worry about that. And anybody can be a great food photographer. Let's see if we have other questions. Any advice on taking pictures of hot food? This is a question from Eddie. I don't know if you could maybe, I don't understand what you mean. But I mean, you could take photos of hot food, but I think maybe you mean how you can add the heat or the smoke, and that's something you could do in the post-processing, or you could add an artificial smoke behind the bowl or the cup. How long did you put together the scene? This is a very good question as well. Actually, it can take a lot of time. And just to, for example, this scene, if this scene was actually not very time consuming because I already had the muffins ready. So I just needed to mix the mascarpone and the blackberries to have the topping, and then I just added the topping on the chocolate muffins and topped them with blueberry and blackberry. So it did not take a long time, but the setup with the backdrop and the lights can take some time, and also to put all the subjects on the backdrop. So I think if you maybe I think I would say 1 hour in total for this scene. How many photos do you take for one dish before you decide that you have the right shots? Very good question. Actually, I take many photos. Sometimes I take 50 photos, and I'm just using maybe three photos. But I think the most important is if you have the possibility to shoot tethered, then you can actually see the photos in a larger dimension, and you can quickly decide if you have the shots that you wanted or not. But I must confess that I take many photos of a scene before I'm pleased with the result. And the last question, what are your biggest tips when it comes to food styling? Well, food styling is an art in itself. And I think I would suggest actually to select a few of the photos that you like, could be on Pinterest or Instagram, and study their composition and also the styling. And then you practice on your own and try to imitate the styling. And the more you practice and the more photos you study, the better you will be to style your own food, and also be better in you'll also be better in composing your photos. So I think actually time is running by very fast. We're already at the end of the webinar, and I see that there are more questions coming in. And if you have any question later, don't hesitate to get in contact with me, and I would be happy to answer. So I would like to thank Wex, BenQ, and X-Rite again for making this webinar possible. And thanks to all of you who connected this evening. I really hope you learned something new and that you can experiment in food photography right away. I wish you all a wonderful evening, and I can't wait to see your food photos.